to tie in the importance of these tribes in Israel's history, as well as their some of the characteristics or the traits from their tribes that are referred to with what is said about the founder of the tribe, the sons of Jacob, in other words. So this morning we're looking at Joshua 16, and give me a second while I put this in. Yeah, so Joshua chapter 16, again, we're looking at the tribe of Ephraim this morning, which is the focus of Joshua chapter 16. Again, we're in the part of the book of Joshua where we're looking at the allotment of the tribes, because the land has essentially already been conquered, so to speak, at least for the most part. And so the rest of the book, again, focuses on how the land gets divided up. We talked about in chapter 14 that the focus was on the earlier division under the time of Moses, where the three tribes that were east of the Jordan River, or at least the two and a half tribes east of the Jordan River, how they got their land. Last week, chapter 15, we looked at the tribe of Judah, and obviously Judah's importance in the perspective of it being kind of the defense for Israel against Egypt, Edom, and the Philistines. And so, again, this morning we're going to look at the division of the tribe of Ephraim, and again, its importance in Israel's history. A couple of key points to think about that we want to emphasize as we look at chapter 16. One key point, and this will come out from the meaning of the name Ephraim, but God, of course, calls us as Christians to be fruitful for him. Again, Matthew chapter 7 and verses 17 through 20. Jesus told his followers about bearing good fruit for God. He also gave the warning, of course, about what happens when we don't. That will come out when we talk about the meaning of the name Ephraim. The other key point, which will come out more to the end of our Bible class with what Ephraim does later in the Old Testament. But we also know that pride can often lead to a lot of internal strife. A lot of times where Christians feel like they've been disrespected, or they feel like they have not gotten what they wanted. In a lot of cases, the improper response to that is rooted in the idea of pride. And we'll tie that in with what happens in Israel's history. But Proverbs 13 and verse 10 essentially says, where there is strife, there is also pride. And we'll see that Ephraim at times posed that problem to the rest of its people. Again, the idea I think that we're going to have moving forward is think about characteristics of these tribes in relation to the larger nation of Israel, and make the comparison about our relationship with the church as a collective whole. So we want to begin by first of all talking about an overview of Ephraim. So Ephraim as a person, right? Was Ephraim a son of Jacob? Ephraim was not a son of Jacob. He was a grandson, right? And we know that based on Genesis 41, verses 50 through 52, which we want to first turn back to this passage and look at that, because it's going to be kind of important for kind of understanding who Ephraim and what they will be as a tribe later on. It'll be important for us to look at this passage. But again, Genesis 41, verses 50 through 52, we read about the birth of Joseph's sons, specifically Manasseh and Ephraim. This is also where we are going to get the meaning of the name for Ephraim. If somebody would read for us Genesis 41, verses 50 through 52.
Now before the year of famine came, two sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. And Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my troubles and all my father's household. And he named the second Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction.
So in the immediate context, the names for both Manasseh and Ephraim which we'll talk about Manasseh next week. But in the context of this passage, Joseph names both of these sons in reference to what was going on in his life, or at least what had happened in his life, right? Manasseh, of course, as we'll talk about next week, connected to what Joseph's brothers had done to him. But again, if you notice verse 52, what's the meaning of the name Ephraim? Yes, the word Ephraim translates to fruitful or fertile in Genesis 41 and verse 52. Now, in the context of where we're at in Genesis 41, why is the concept of fruitful important to the life of Joseph? What's happened up to this point in Joseph's life? Say that louder. There's about to be a famine, right? If you go back to earlier in Genesis 41, Joseph had the dream, Pharaoh had the dream. Joseph interpreted the meaning of it. And Pharaoh was wanting to know what the meaning of it was, and Joseph essentially said, there is going to come a famine. There's going to be 7 years of plenty, but then after that, there is going to be a famine. And so Ephraim's name, in part, Ephraim is named rightfully so because, at this point in Joseph's life, Joseph is trying to honor the fact that God has protected him to this point. Again, Manasseh we'll touch more on next week, but specifically for Ephraim, we note that, again, Joseph has, as Joseph says, verse 52, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Now, that's a reference to Joseph, of course, rising up to be the manager of Pharaoh's household. We know plays out in the book of Genesis. And so it's a reference to that, but it's also a reference to the fact that Joseph is about to help preserve Egypt because of the execution of his plan. Again, in verses 52 through verse 57, prior to the famine hitting the earth, in verse 56, what did the Egyptians do based on Joseph's advice to Pharaoh? Right. In other words, they prepared for that famine, right? And that goes back to the idea again of Joseph. God has helped make Joseph fruitful. He's put him in a good position, and that is reflected in the name of his son Ephraim. That's going to be important when we talk about a little bit later on the impact of the tribe of Ephraim in general. But I think this is a good reminder here, right? God put Joseph in a position, and obviously God would later expect Joseph to kind of reward the blessings that he had received because we know Joseph is going to be responsible for helping take care of his dad and his brethren. And obviously that is very important because we're not talking about any of the rest of the Old Testament if Joseph does not help preserve his father's house. And so the point of application for us is, simple, right? Joseph would later be fruitful, as the name Ephraim indicates, in terms of helping preserve his father's house. So the point of application we can get, in one sense, from Ephraim as a person is obviously God wants us to be fruitful as well. We're not necessarily saving physical lives like what Joseph is doing, but obviously in terms of saving spiritual lives, that's something that we should be fruitful in. Again, you think about Matthew 7. Again, we'll bring this up perhaps in a minute. John 15. That's going to be important. So that's Ephraim as a person. Let's move a few chapters forward and talk about Ephraim and Manasseh and how they are blessed by Jacob. And so the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh takes place in Genesis chapter 48. Which one of the two sons was born first? Manasseh was born first, according to Genesis 41, 50 through 52. And so since Manasseh was born first, he should have been the first one to have been blessed. But in that situation, in Genesis chapter 48, what happened when Joseph placed Manasseh on Jacob's right and placed Ephraim on Jacob's left? Yeah, he crosses his hands, right? Again, if you look at Genesis 48, 17 through 22, it says that Joseph saw his father lay his right hand upon the head of Ephraim. It displeased him, and he held up his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head unto Manasseh's head. And Joseph said unto his father, Not so, my father. Joseph said unto his father, Not so, my father, for this is the firstborn. Put thy right hand upon his head. And his father refused and said, I know it, my son, I know it. He shall also become a people, and he shall also be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. And he blessed them that day, saying, In thee shall Israel bless, saying, God make thee as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. And Israel said unto Joseph, Behold, I die, but God shall be with you, and bring you again unto the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and with my bow. But the point is that Ephraim was blessed first, and as Jacob indicates here, Ephraim would be greater than Manasseh. Ephraim would become greater than Manasseh. Now, as we'll see next week, it's not going to be just because of land, right? Manasseh, if you look at the 12 tribes, Manasseh has a whole lot more land. But in what sense would Ephraim become greater than Manasseh? Later on in Israel's history, what would the northern kingdom of Israel often be called? Yeah, when you get later on into the Old Testament, when the northern kingdom is divided, the northern kingdom of Israel would be called Ephraim. And again, that's kind of a reference to the idea that Ephraim would surpass Manasseh and its importance. But Jacob would also say that Ephraim would eventually become a fruitful tree. Again, look at Genesis 49 and verse 22. Yeah, go ahead.
Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. Its branches run over a wall.
So notice there that Jacob would say in the chapter where he blesses all of his sons, he says that Joseph is a fruitful bough, or if you've got another translation, a fruitful son, a fruitful tree. It's what the idea of the word bough means. And that, again, is a reference to specifically Ephraim. Again, the name meaning fruitful. Again, implying that Ephraim is going to be one of the tribes that's going to take on a lot more prominence in the Old Testament. So then that's going to help us. And the reason why we go through that is because it helps us now understand why Ephraim is going to be the second tribe to receive its lot. It's because of this promise that Ephraim would be greater than Manasseh, and it's a reference to the fact that Ephraim would take on a greater role than the other tribes moving forward. And so in verses 1 through 4, when we look at Joshua 16, what is given to us are the boundaries of the sons of Joseph. All right, so again, keep in mind that the way that this process is working is that lots are being cast. The first lot fell to Judah. That again was a reference to Judah's overall significance, as we know, both militarily, but also, of course, that through the tribe of Judah you would have the Messiah, right? And obviously David and the establishment of the kingdom of Israel. And so Judah got the first lot, in part for that reason. But now, in this same process, verse 1, it says that the lot of the children of Joseph fell. And in a minute, we'll go through the boundaries. But that's the important thing. Next up in the lot that God, again, is divinely selecting is the children of Joseph. And so verses 1 through 4, we're not going to look. Again, here's Manasseh. We'll talk about the eastern part a little bit later, next week, in other words. But at least west of the Jordan River, we're talking about Manasseh, and we're talking about Ephraim. And so verses 1 through 4 is basically describing the southern territory, which I know Dan is kind of taken away here, but these cities that are listed in verses 1 through 4 are describing this southern boundary between Manasseh, Ephraim, and then it's not pictured here, but you've got the tribe of Dan over to the left. And essentially that's what's being described in verses 1 through 4. Again, we'll talk about maybe some of the importance of this territory a little bit later. But the reason why in verses 1 through 4 that the lot falls to both of them combined is again a reference to Genesis 49, verses 22 through 26, which again is the chapter where all the sons of Jacob are blessed. And again in Genesis 49, Ephraim and Manasseh in that chapter are both blessed together. And so that's why verses 1 through 4, the lot falls to them. And then obviously beginning in verse 5, the land is divided between Ephraim and Manasseh. Again, you're also going to note here that verse 5, of the two sons of Joseph, it's Ephraim that gets the allotment first. Again, that is a reference back to Jacob's promise and Jacob putting his right hand on Ephraim. Again, that's a reference to what Jacob has already promised, that Ephraim would become greater than Manasseh. Here, because Ephraim gets its allotment of land first. So, we look at verses 1 through 4. Again, some of these cities, again, are important. Again, most of this is describing the southern boundary down here. I will point out here that in verse 2 and verse 3, you've got two groups of people that are mentioned here. And one of these groups of people are called the Archites. And they would have been located, based on the map, they would have been located along the border of Ephraim and Benjamin. And they were a group of people that were descendants of Canaan. So they were technically under that curse of Canaan. In other words, these were a group of people that the Israelites were expected to completely wipe out, yet they don't. Again, because of the reference to the Archites here. But we don't know a whole lot about this group of people other than where they kind of live. But later on, there is a specific Archite, one of these people, that becomes very important in Israel's history, and that has to deal with the time of David. One of these Archites, one of these people that are mentioned here, wind up being very crucial in helping David regain the throne in 2 Samuel 15. Because in 2 Samuel 15, who has essentially driven David away from the throne? Absalom, right? Remember that David kind of had to flee out of Jerusalem because he had lost a lot of the favor with the people. People wanted Absalom to be king. In 2 Samuel 15, we read about Absalom going back to take over as the king of Israel. And there's a specific guy named Hushai who gives advice to Absalom, but in 2 Samuel 15 verses 12 or 2 Samuel 15 verses 32 through 37, we're informed that Hushai is actually providing information to David to help him eventually become king again. And he is essentially a descendant of these group of people that still remained, at least at this point, by the time of Joshua. So again, a group of people that we may not know a whole lot about, but they're actually pretty important to helping, at least a descendant, is very important in helping David regain the throne much later on. Again, in my mind, it also is reflective of an overall point in the book of Joshua that needs to be hammered home, and that's that God was concerned about the fate of the Canaanites. A lot of people say that he was not, but again, it's a Canaanite, a descendant of the Canaanite, who helps David regain the throne. That's something we may easily miss as we read through Joshua 16. You've got another group of people called the Japhletites, who are more than likely a group of people that descended from Asher. We're not going to read this, but 1 Chronicles 7 verses 30 through 33 lists the sons of Asher. And there's a guy named Japhet who is listed as a son. And so as a consequence, these people are perhaps essentially descendants from Asher. And one of the things that does bring out that we might not think about, even though these tribes are getting their land within the territory of Israel, apparently some people that belong to the tribe of Asher, for instance, didn't necessarily live in the tribe of Asher. In other words, when they're dividing this land up, we're thinking that the people that live in Asher, they've all got to be descendants from Asher. Technically, that's not always true. And that's something, at least for me, that I personally didn't consider until I was looking at who these people were. But when these tribes are divided up, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the people that live in that tribe are actual descendants of that person. The Japhletites would be an example of that. And so the boundaries are described. These people are mentioned verses 1 through 4. And then what happens in verse 5 is we've got an overall description of the boundaries of Ephraim. So again, Ephraim's specific lot comes first. Again, that goes back to Genesis 48. And I'm going to try to point out a couple of these things. This is going to be kind of hard to see, but this is a zoomed-in map of the tribe of Ephraim. Again, Dan bordered to the south and west, Benjamin to the south, Manasseh, again, encompassing the entire area. But these are kind of the approximate locations of some of these cities that are mentioned. I'll point out a few of them. Of course, you've got Jericho down here to the southeast, which is a tribe that is it's a city allotted to the tribe of Benjamin. That, of course, marked the southeastern boundary of the tribe. You've got Mikmethath, which is mentioned in verse 6. That city kind of marked the furthest north in terms of the location of Ephraim. And you've obviously got the city of Gezer all the way down here, which mark kind of the southwestern boundary of the tribe. Again, these are all, the importance of all this is again to remind the people that, these are your boundaries, and these are boundaries that God has set through the casting of lots. So that way you should not have any type of internal conflict. But as it would be true for the tribe of Ephraim, that's exactly what will happen. So you can look at verses 5 through 10, and that's, again, what we have mentioned here. One thing that I will say about verse 10, verse 10 indicates that there was a group of people. They drove not out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwell among the Ephraimites unto this day and serve under tribute. Again, that does foreshadow later problems. I will mention, and I don't have this up here, but under the time of Solomon, the inhabitants of Gezer would become part of the kingdom of Israel. And we know, of course, that later on, Solomon, of course, does have a problem with idolatry and foreign wives. Maybe the people of Gezer had an impact on that when they officially became a part of the kingdom of Israel. So that's perhaps why that footnote is given to us. At the time, the reason why it would be important is, again, the Israelites were told to wipe out all the Canaanites, and a later generation of Israelites may say, why do these Canaanites in Gezer, why are they still here? It's because it goes back to the time of Joshua, is the point. So on the last slide, what we'll do is look at Ephraim moving forward. There are several famous characters that come from the tribe of Ephraim, and that's what we want to look at first. Three, perhaps, of the most important people that come from the tribe of Ephraim. One of those people is obviously who? Joshua. Joshua is perhaps the most famous individual to come from the tribe of Ephraim. We'll look at in a few weeks Joshua 19, but Joshua is actually going to get a lot of land in Ephraim, and that's because he is from the tribe of Ephraim. There was a very famous female judge who was from the tribe of Ephraim, and that would be Deborah. As we'll see, the tribe of Ephraim plays a pretty prominent role in the book of Judges, and we'll talk about Deborah when we get there. There's also another judge that's from the tribe of Ephraim, and that was the last judge of Israel, who was Samuel. These three important characters from the Old Testament were all from the tribe of Ephraim. And we've already talked about Samuel, but like with Deborah, we'll talk about her story when we get to the book of Judges. But again, Judah produced a lot of prominent people. Ephraim produced a lot of prominent people as well. These are all relatively good figures. We know that the tribe of Ephraim would produce some very poor characters in the Old Testament. Probably the most famous of these poor characters was Jezebel's husband, who was Ahab. Ahab was likewise from the tribe of Ephraim. So the last thing that we'll talk about now is Ephraim as a tribe moving forward. Why are they important to the Old Testament? Again, we mentioned this at the beginning of the Bible class, but there is a reason why. For instance, in the book of Hosea, for instance, Hosea would refer to the northern kingdom of Israel as Ephraim. And that's because as Judah kind of takes on the role of being the most prominent tribe, Ephraim is kind of second behind it. In one regard, because of what Jacob had promised to Joseph, and because of how the lots had fallen. We'll come back to that in a minute. But Ephraim takes on importance for that reason, in part for that. Another important thing to keep in mind about the tribe of Ephraim is that it was the location where the city of Shiloh was located. And Shiloh becomes important because that is the first location of the tabernacle when the people of God entered into the land of Canaan, as they have in Joshua. One thing that I did not mention, but a lot of the tribe of Ephraim resides in what's called the hill country of Israel. And Obviously, that could be connected, that we could connect that to Shiloh, the location of the tabernacle. Obviously, later on, when Israel did fall into a problem of idolatry, where were a lot of those idolatrous places located? They were located in the hills. And so the point is, there is a spiritual significance between height in terms of geography, like height, hills, mountains. There's a connection between that and religious importance. For the people of Israel, the tribe of Ephraim was important at one point because this is the center of Israel's worship at this point, at the tabernacle, again, located in Shiloh. I don't have this up here. The city of Gilgal was also located in Ephraim. And at this point in the book of Joshua, Gilgal kind of serves as the capital city, really up until David conquers Jerusalem and establishes Jerusalem as the new capital. So Ephraim is important. Its importance also comes from the spiritual significance that the tribe holds at this point. And that brings us to our last point for why it's important as a tribe. But Ephraim would later become a problem because of internal contention. We'll talk about this in the book of Judges. But the judge, is it Japheth or Jephthah? Jephthah, right? The judge. I get him and Noah's son mixed up, Jephthah. There's a problem that comes out in Judges chapter 12 where Jephthah has to deal with the tribe of Ephraim because they have become upset because they were not invited to participate in a battle. But most significantly, Ephraim is a source of internal contention because what happens in 1 Kings chapter 11 following the death of Solomon? The kingdom splits, right? Where you have a southern kingdom led by Solomon's son Rehoboam and a northern kingdom that is led by who? Jeroboam. And obviously one of the contentions for why the kingdom was divided was because of the harsh taxes and policies and things like that. But another reason why is in part because Jeroboam, who was of the tribe of Ephraim, wanted to establish his own kingdom. Again, we remember that Jeroboam was at one point an advisor, I believe an advisor to Solomon. But if you look at 1 Kings 11, verse 26, it says that Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephrathite, or of the tribe of Ephraim, of Zeradah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow woman, even he lifted up his hand against the king. And one of the reasons why an individual like Jeroboam, leading the tribe of Ephraim, why they rebel against the house of David is in part because of pride. After all, what happens under the kingdom of Jeroboam when all the people in the northern part of when all the people in Israel are starting to move south? What does Jeroboam want to do? Right. He establishes worship places in Dan and Bethel. Those were both acts that challenged the sovereignty of God. The reason why he did that is because pride was sitting at the root of his heart, right? We can't lose all these people to the southern kingdom. It doesn't reflect well on us, so we'll build these worship centers there. That is evident of the problem of pride, then being the reason why Jeroboam didn't have any problem with contending with the house of David. And so that's what we can gather from looking at Ephraim. Pride becomes a problem within that tribe, and it leads to internal contention. Likewise for us, if we become proud, especially if we feel like we have done a lot for the Lord, we've done a lot for the church, but we don't get recognized. That can turn into an ugly situation if pride gets the best of us, and that causes us to look unfavorably at our fellow Christians, to the point where we start to take matters into our own hands, like what Ephraim did under Jeroboam. But anyway, we'll stop here this morning. We'll pick up in chapter 17 next week, looking at Manasseh. But thank you for your time and your attention.